Where does it all come from? Not just the stars and the planets, but order, beauty, love, and brokenness. Every worldview must answer the question of origins. The Bible's answer is the most audacious and profound story ever told. It begins not with an accident, but with an artist. Not with chaos, but with a command. This is the story of Genesis, the beginning of everything. For thousands of years, this ancient book has shaped civilizations, inspired art, and offered a framework for understanding our place in the universe. But it's more than just a collection of old stories. It's a masterfully woven narrative that diagnoses the human condition with breathtaking accuracy and points toward a hope that echoes from the first page to the last. Today, we journey back to that beginning. We will explore the magnificent creation of the cosmos, witness the birth of humanity, feel the heartbreak of its fall, and follow the thread of a single divine promise as it's passed down through a flawed but chosen family. This is not just a story about the past. It's the story of everyone, the story that explains our world and ourselves. This is Genesis. The book of Genesis is a work of literary genius, intentionally structured in two main parts. The first part, chapters 1 through 11, paints on a universal canvas. It tells the story of God and the entire world, establishing the grand themes that will resonate through the rest of the Bible. God's good creation, humanity's tragic rebellion, and the devastating consequences of sin that fracture our relationship with God, with each other, and with the world itself. This is the story that sets the stage for God's epic rescue plan. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. These opening words are among the most famous ever written. But to truly understand their power, we have to hear them as their first audience would have. In the ancient world, Israel was surrounded by cultures with very different stories about creation. In the Babylonian myth, the Enuma Elish, the world is born from violence, a chaotic battle between warring, amoral gods. The cosmos is fashioned from the corpse of a slain goddess, and humanity is created from the blood of a demon god designed for one purpose: to be slaves, to do the dirty work the gods didn't want to do. Into this dark and violent world, the opening of Genesis lands like a thunderclap of revolution. The author makes a radical claim. The universe was not born from conflict, but from the peaceful, powerful, and purposeful word of a single, good, and all-powerful creator. There is no battle, no cosmic war. There is only God who speaks and brings a world of order and beauty into existence, out of darkness and chaos. The text is structured with the precision of a poem. The first 3 days of creation establish the realms of existence. On day 1, God separates light from darkness. On day 2, he separates the waters above from the waters below, creating the sky. On day 3, he separates the water from the dry land. He creates the spaces, the domains. Then, in the next 3 days, he fills those realms with rulers. On day 4, he fills the domain of light and dark with the sun, moon, and stars. On day 5, he fills the skies and seas with birds and fish. And on day 6, he fills the land with animals, and, as the climax of his work, with humanity. This elegant, symmetrical structure isn't trying to be a scientific report. It's a theological masterpiece. It portrays God as a divine artist, bringing order and function to the cosmos, transforming it into what the ancients would have recognized as a cosmic temple, a sacred space where God dwells with his creation. And at the pinnacle of this temple, God places his image bearers. Then God said,
Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule. To be made in the image of God wasn't just about having a soul or being intelligent. In the ancient world, kings would set up statues, images of themselves throughout their kingdom to represent their authority. Humanity is God's living statue, his royal representatives on earth. We are given a divine commission, a purpose, to rule God's world on his behalf, to cultivate its potential, to care for it, and to fill it with more image bearers, extending the goodness and flourishing of God's garden temple to every corner of the planet. This is a vision of humanity with breathtaking dignity. We are not slaves born from violence. We are royalty, appointed as partners in God's creative project. Theologians throughout history, like the great Saint Augustine of Hippo, recognized that the primary purpose of this text was theological, not scientific. Augustine warned against an overly rigid, woodenly literal reading of the 7 days, understanding that it could create false conflicts with the observable world and distract from the profound truths the author was communicating. The point of Genesis 1 is not to tell us how old the earth is, but to tell us who God is and why we are here. It declares that the world is good, that it is ordered, and that it is the handiwork of a wise and generous king. Genesis begins by painting a masterpiece of a world humming with purpose, a world where humanity is not a slave, but royalty, crowned with the very image of God, and tasked with extending his goodness to every corner of creation.
Genesis 2 zooms in from the cosmic scale to a personal one. We see God, like a potter, forming the first man, Adam, from the dust of the ground, and breathing into him the breath of life. He places him in a garden, a place of perfect communion and partnership. But this idyllic scene is soon interrupted by a sinister voice. A serpent, a creature in rebellion against God, enters the story. It doesn't challenge God with force, but with a question, a subtle twisting of reality. Did God really say? The serpent's strategy is to plant a seed of doubt about God's character. It presents a rival story about the world, a lie that God is not a generous provider, but a cosmic killjoy, holding humanity back from its true potential. The serpent whispers that true freedom and wisdom are found not in trusting God, but in seizing autonomy from him, in defining good and evil for ourselves. The writer, C.S. Lewis, identified the core of this temptation as the desire to be their own masters, to invent a form of happiness for themselves apart from God. This is the essence of sin. It's not just breaking a rule, it's a declaration of independence from the Creator. It's the creature trying to sit on the Creator's throne. And in that moment of choice, Adam and Eve believed the lie. They ate the fruit. The first consequence isn't a lightning bolt from heaven. It's a chilling silence, a sudden, terrifying awareness of their own vulnerability. Their first instinct is to cover themselves, and then to hide from the very presence that was the source of their life. The fall was a relational catastrophe that shattered 4 fundamental connections at once. First, their relationship with God was broken. Intimacy was replaced by fear and hiding. Second, their relationship with themselves was broken. Innocence was replaced by shame. Third, their relationship with each other was broken. Unity was replaced by blame shifting and accusation. And fourth, their relationship with creation was broken.
Harmony was replaced by a curse, bringing toil, pain, and struggle into the human experience. The world made very good by God is now marred by humanity's choice. But even here, in this moment of judgment and tragedy, a glimmer of hope appears. In Genesis 3:15, God speaks to the serpent, and in his curse, he embeds a promise. He declares that one day a seed, a descendant of the woman, will come. This descendant will be wounded in the process, bruised on the heel, but he will deliver a crushing, fatal blow to the serpent's head. This is the first whisper of the gospel, the proto-evangelium. It's a mysterious promise of a wounded victor who will one day come to undo the serpent's work and begin God's long, patient plan of redemption. The story of the Bible from this point forward is the story of this promise unfolding. The tragedy of the garden is not about a piece of fruit. It's about the moment humanity traded the intimacy of walking with God for the illusion of being their own God.
The choice made in the garden was not an isolated event. Genesis chapters 4 through 6 show how the venom of sin, once injected into the human heart, spreads like a contagion, corrupting everything it touches. The narrative intentionally shows the pattern of the fall repeating and amplifying with each generation. The story moves from the garden to the field with Adam and Eve's two sons, Cain and Abel. The relational fracture between husband and wife now erupts into the first murder. Cain, consumed by jealousy over his brother's accepted offering, gives in to the same self-centered pride that defined his parents' sin. God warns him, "Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." But Cain does not rule over it. He lets it rule him. He kills his brother. And just as his parents were exiled from the garden, Cain is now exiled from his family and community, cursed to wander east of Eden. The pattern is established. Sin leads to exile. Cain then builds the first city. It's a symbol of human civilization, but it is founded in violence and self-preservation, a community built apart from God. This trajectory of corruption accelerates dramatically just a few generations later with Cain's descendant, Lamech. Lamech boasts to his wives in a chilling poem of vengeance, "I have killed a man for wounding me." If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. This is terrifying. The seed of pride in the garden has sprouted into a vine of murder with Cain, and now, with Lamech, it has grown into a forest of arrogant, escalating violence. Humanity is not getting better, it is spiraling downward, faster and faster. This downward spiral reaches its nadir in the strange and mysterious story of the sons of God and the Nephilim in Genesis 6. While interpretations vary, the story functions in the narrative to depict a world so completely saturated with corruption, rebellion, and violence that it grieves the very heart of God. The text says, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled." The pattern scales up once more. A single act of disobedience led to exile from the garden. A single act of murder led to Cain's exile. Now a world full of rebellion will lead to the entire world being exiled under the waters of a cataclysmic flood. Sin,
once unleashed, is never static. It is a contagion that spreads from a broken heart to a brother's blood, from a family's feud to a world drowning in its own violence.
The story of the flood is one of the most famous and terrifying in the Bible. But to read it only as a story of God's anger is to miss its profound depth. The narrative frames it first as an act of divine heartbreak. The Creator is pained by the self-destruction of the world he loves. The flood is presented as a tragic necessity, an act of cosmic surgery to cleanse the world of a terminal cancer of evil. The language the author uses is precise and powerful. The flood is a systematic decreation, a reversal of the ordering work of Genesis 1. The windows of heaven and the fountains of the great deep are opened, undoing the separation of the waters God established on day 2. The world is returned to the dark, watery chaos from which it began, washed clean of humanity's corruption. But amidst this overwhelming judgment, God preserves a remnant of hope. He finds one righteous man, Noah. Noah is commissioned as a new Adam, tasked with building an ark, a floating sanctuary to save his family and a representation of every kind of animal. Through him, God will press the reset button on the human project. After the waters recede, Noah and his family step out onto a new, clean earth. God blesses them with the same command he gave to Adam: be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. It feels like a new beginning. But then the story takes a tragic turn. Noah plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and lies uncovered in his tent. His son Ham acts shamefully toward him, and the episode ends with curses and broken relationships. It's a sad, pathetic echo of the shame and blame in the Garden of Eden. The message is devastatingly clear. The flood washed away a world of sinners, but it did not wash away sin itself. The problem isn't just out there in the world. The problem is in the human heart. A new strategy is needed. And so, God initiates one. In Genesis 9, he establishes a formal covenant, a binding promise, not just with Noah, but with all humanity and every living creature. He promises that he will never again destroy the world with a flood. This promise is unconditional. It doesn't depend on human goodness. It is an act of pure grace. And he sets a sign in the clouds to seal it. The rainbow is not a symbol of human potential. It is a symbol of divine patience. It is God hanging up his warrior's bow, a promise to preserve the world in stability so that his greater plan of redemption can unfold. The flood is a terrifying story of judgment, but it is also a story of God's tears. And the rainbow is not a promise that humanity will be good, but a promise that God, in his grace, will be faithful even when we are not. The first act of Genesis concludes with one final climactic story of humanity's united rebellion, the Tower of Babel. After the flood, God had commanded humanity to fill the earth, but instead the people do the exact opposite. They migrate east and settle in one place, the land of Shinar. And there they decide to build a city and a tower that reaches to the heavens. Their motive is explicit. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. This is the philosophy of the Garden of Eden scaled up to a civilization. It is the pinnacle of human pride, the desire for self-glorification, and the attempt to create unity and security on their terms, apart from God. The tower is a monument to human arrogance, a man-made mountain designed to storm the heavens and usurp God's glory. God's response is both a judgment and a mercy. He comes down, confuses their language, and scatters them across the earth, fulfilling his original command in the process. This act prevents a unified, godless human empire from reaching its full, destructive potential. He saves humanity from its own worst impulses. But the story of Babel is more than just an explanation for different languages. It is the crucial hinge that connects the two halves of Genesis. It represents the final failure of the human project on a global scale. Humanity, united in its ambition to make a name for itself, ends up scattered and confused. And it is right here, in the rubble of this failed human project, that God reveals his stunning, upside-down plan for rescue. The problem of Babel is immediately answered by the promise to Abraham. The narrative connection is breathtakingly precise. In Genesis 11, humanity says, "Let us make a name for ourselves." In the very next chapter, Genesis 12, God says to a single unknown man named Abram, "I will make your name great." Humanity's attempt at self-glorification led to scattering and division. God's new plan of grace, starting with one man and his family, will be the true path to a great name and ultimately a blessing for all the scattered nations of the earth. Babel is the story of humanity building a monument to its own pride, only to be scattered by the weight of it. It is the final failed attempt to reach heaven before God himself decides to bring heaven to earth. With the failure at Babel, the narrative of Genesis makes a dramatic shift. The camera zooms in from the wide-angle lens of all humanity to the tight focus of one man and his family. Chapters 12 through 50 trace the story of God's promise through 4 generations: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. This is where God begins to implement his specific long-term solution to the problem of sin and rebellion that was diagnosed in the first 11 chapters. He will rescue the world not through an empire, but through a family. The story begins with God's call to a man named Abram, living in Ur of the Chaldees, a center of pagan worship. God's command is simple and absolute. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. With this call comes a foundational promise, a covenant that will become the theological backbone for the rest of the entire Bible. It's a 3-part promise. First, God promises Abram land and descendants. I will make you into a great nation. Second, he promises personal blessing. I will bless you. I will make your name great. And third, he promises universal redemption, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. This is God's answer to the curse of Eden and the scattering of Babel. Through this one man's family, God will restore his blessing to the world. The book of Hebrews tells us that by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. This is a remarkable act of trust. But the story of Abraham is not the story of a perfect hero. It's the story of a flawed man on a messy journey of faith, whose success depends entirely on the faithfulness of the God who called him. Twice, out of fear for his own life, Abraham lies and claims his wife Sarah is his sister, endangering the very promise of an heir. When years pass and Sarah remains barren, he and Sarah take matters into their own hands, trying to help God fulfill his promise by having a child, Ishmael, through Sarah's servant, Hagar, an act that leads to immense pain and family conflict. Abraham stumbles, he doubts, he fails, but through it all, he keeps returning to God.
His faith is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep walking forward in obedience, even with a limp. The most profound moment comes in Genesis 15. God formalizes his covenant with Abraham. In an ancient ritual, animals are cut in half, and the two parties of the covenant would walk between the pieces, essentially saying, "If I break this oath, may I become like these animals." But in this ceremony, Abraham is put into a deep sleep, and he watches as a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, symbols of God's own presence, pass between the pieces alone. The message is stunning. God is taking the entire weight of the covenant upon himself. He is making a unilateral, unconditional oath. He is guaranteeing that this promise will be fulfilled, not because of Abraham's perfection, but because of God's own unwavering faithfulness. With Abraham, God's plan for saving the world pivots from the epic to the intimate. The healing of the nations would begin not with a crown, but with a tent, a promise, and the faltering footsteps of a man of faith.
The journey of Abraham's faith reaches its terrifying and profound climax in Genesis 22. After decades of waiting, Abraham and Sarah finally have their promised son, Isaac. He is the miracle child, the sole heir of the covenant. And then, God issues the most bewildering command imaginable. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. This command seems to contradict everything God has promised. To kill Isaac is to kill the covenant itself. Every rational and emotional instinct would scream against it. Yet the text tells us that early the next morning, Abraham sets out to obey. For 3 days, he travels with the son he is commanded to kill. Isaac, carrying the wood for his own sacrifice, asks the heartbreaking question, "Father, where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's reply is a masterpiece of faith and prophecy. God himself will provide the lamb. On the mountain, Abraham builds the altar, binds his son, and raises the knife. At that final, terrible moment, the angel of the Lord calls out, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught in a thicket. He sacrifices the ram instead of his son, and he names that place Yahweh Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. This story is the ultimate test of Abraham's faith. The book of Hebrews explains that Abraham reasoned that God could even raise Isaac from the dead to fulfill his promise. But it is more than a test of Abraham. It is a revelation of God. On that mountain, God revealed his own heart. He is not a God who demands child sacrifice, a common practice in the surrounding pagan cultures. He is the God who provides the sacrifice. The story is less about what God demands from Abraham and more about what God will one day give for humanity. The event is saturated with foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. A father offers his beloved son. The son carries the wood for his own sacrifice up a hill. The event takes place in the land of Moriah, the very region where Jerusalem would later be built, and where 2,000 years later, God would provide his own son, Jesus, as the ultimate lamb, the final sacrifice to fulfill the promise made to Abraham. After this climax, the covenant passes to Isaac. His life is quieter, less dramatic than his father's. He is the bridge generation, a man who, despite his own failures that often mirror Abraham's, receives the reaffirmation of the promise, showing that the covenant moves forward by God's grace, not human merit. On Mount Moriah, Abraham learned the deepest truth of faith. God's greatest commands are often the prelude to his most profound provisions. He was asked to give up his future, only to discover that God himself was holding it all along. The story of the next patriarch, Jacob, is a masterclass in the scandalous grace of God. His very name means he grasps the heel, or more colloquially, he deceives. And for the first half of his life, he lives up to it perfectly. Jacob is the younger twin, but God had declared before his birth that the older will serve the younger, a choice based not on merit, but on God's sovereign purpose. Yet Jacob doesn't trust God's promise. He spends his life scheming and struggling to secure the blessing for himself. He swindles his famished brother Esau out of his birthright for a bowl of stew. Later, he conspires with his mother Rebekah to deceive his blind, elderly father Isaac, stealing the blessing meant for Esau. His deception works, but it costs him everything. He is forced to flee for his life from his brother's murderous rage. And in a perfect turn of poetic justice, Jacob the deceiver finds himself in the household of his uncle Laban, a man even more cunning than he is. For 20 years, Jacob is tricked, cheated, and manipulated, getting a taste of his own medicine. Yet even in Jacob's flight and exile, God pursues him. At Bethel, God meets him in a dream and confirms the Abrahamic covenant, promising, "I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go." God's faithfulness to Jacob is not based on Jacob's faithfulness to him. The turning point of Jacob's life comes after 20 years as he prepares to return home and face the brother he wronged. The night before their reunion, he sends his family ahead and remains alone by the river Jabbok. There, a mysterious man appears and wrestles with him until daybreak. This physical struggle is a perfect metaphor for Jacob's entire life, a life spent wrestling with God and with people to get what he wants. As the sun rises, Jacob refuses to let go until his opponent blesses him. The man asks, "What is your name?" And for the first time, Jacob must confess who he is, Jacob, the deceiver. In that moment of confession, he is given a new name, Israel, which means he struggles with God. He leaves the encounter with two things, a new name and a permanent limp, a lifelong reminder of his broken self-alliance. Jacob spent his life wrestling for a blessing he could have simply received. His story ends with a limp and a new name, a permanent reminder that we only truly win our struggle with God when we surrender. The final major narrative of Genesis, the story of Jacob's son Joseph, is one of the most beautifully crafted stories in all of literature. It serves as the book's ultimate case study in the hidden, sovereign, and redemptive providence of God. The story begins once again with family dysfunction. Joseph is the favorite of his father Jacob's 12 sons, and his brothers are consumed with jealousy, a jealousy that boils over into hatred when Joseph shares his dreams of them bowing down to him. In a brutal act of betrayal, they throw him into a pit and sell him into slavery in Egypt. Joseph's life becomes a series of devastating descents. He is a slave in the house of Potiphar, an Egyptian official. Then, after being falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, he is thrown into prison. From the pit of his brother's betrayal to the pit of an Egyptian dungeon, Joseph's life seems to be a story of injustice and abandonment. But a key phrase punctuates the narrative, appearing again and again like a drumbeat of hope. The Lord was with Joseph.
God's presence and favor are not dependent on Joseph's circumstances. In every situation, Joseph responds not with bitterness, but with remarkable integrity and faithfulness. He works diligently as a slave and becomes a trusted administrator in prison. Eventually, through his God-given ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph is raised from the prison to the palace. He predicts a coming famine and is appointed second in command over all of Egypt, tasked with preparing the nation to survive. When the famine strikes, his wisdom saves not only Egypt, but the surrounding nations, including the very family that betrayed him. Joseph's life is a powerful foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. He is a beloved son, rejected by his own brothers, sold for pieces of silver. He suffers unjustly despite his innocence. He is raised from a pit of death to a position of supreme authority. And from that position, he uses his power not for revenge, but to forgive and save the very people who sought to destroy him. His story is a thematic reversal of the patterns of sin we saw earlier in Genesis. Where Cain's jealousy led to murder, Joseph's suffering leads to his brother's salvation. Where Adam's failure brought a curse of toil and famine, Joseph's wisdom brings bread and life. Through one faithful man, God begins to untangle the knots of sin that have plagued humanity since the garden. Joseph's life teaches us that our deepest pits can become the platforms for God's greatest purposes. He was a man who lost his coat of many colors only to be clothed in the authority to save the world.
The book of Genesis reaches its theological climax in its final chapter. After their father Jacob dies, Joseph's brothers are terrified. They believe that now, with their father gone, Joseph will finally exact his revenge for their betrayal years ago. They come to him, fall at his feet, and offer themselves as his slaves. But Joseph weeps, and in his response, he speaks the verse that serves as the interpretive key to his entire life, and indeed, to the entire patriarchal narrative. He says to them, "Don't be afraid. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." This single, breathtaking statement encapsulates the central theme of God's providence. The stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are not stories about perfect heroes. They are stories filled with fear, deception, struggle, and betrayal. They are stories of deeply flawed people, but they are ultimately stories about a perfect and sovereign God who masterfully and mysteriously weaves the dark, tangled threads of human sin and failure into the beautiful tapestry of his redemptive plan. God's promises are not thwarted by human weakness. In fact, he often uses human weakness as the very stage upon which his power and faithfulness are most brilliantly displayed. But the book does not end with a triumphant return to the promised land. It ends with a strange and poignant image. So Joseph died, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. A coffin in Egypt. This ending is deliberate and powerful. It leaves God's people in a state of waiting, of suspense. The promise of the land has not yet been fulfilled. Joseph's final act is one of faith. He makes his sons swear an oath that when God finally redeems them, they will carry his bones with them out of Egypt and back to the land of promise. This final scene creates a narrative tension, an open loop that makes the next book of the Bible, Exodus, not just a sequel, but a necessity. Genesis masterfully diagnoses the problem of sin, death, and exile, and it establishes God's covenant promise as the only hope for a solution. It ends with God's people waiting, holding on to that promise, looking for the day of their redemption. As the theologian N.T. Wright has said, Genesis 1 through 11 acts as the Old Testament of the Old Testament,
providing the foundational story that gives meaning to everything that follows. The final message of Genesis is the thesis of the entire Bible. Human hands may weave tangled webs of evil, but God's hands are always weaving a masterpiece of redemption.
From the creation of the cosmos to a coffin in Egypt, the book of Genesis tells a sweeping story of divine purpose and human failure, of a world made good and broken by sin, and of a God who refuses to abandon his creation. The story that began in a garden, with humanity walking in perfect communion with God, ends in a foreign land, with the people of the promise waiting for a deliverance that has not yet come. Genesis is a book of beginnings, but it is also a book of questions. It introduces the profound problems of sin, exile, and death, problems that cry out for a resolution. And throughout its pages, it plants clues and hints, prophetic figures and patterns that point forward to the one who will ultimately be that resolution, the promised seed of the woman who will crush the serpent's head, the true and final son of Abraham, through whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed, the ultimate wounded victor who wrestled with God and man for our sake, the rejected brother whose suffering would save the world. All of these threads, woven so carefully through the narrative of Genesis, find their ultimate fulfillment in one person, Jesus Christ. The book of Genesis is the first word of the story, but it points relentlessly to the final word. The questions it raises find their answer, and the promises it makes find their ultimate yes in Him. If this journey through the beginning has deepened your understanding of God's magnificent plan, subscribe and join our community as we continue to explore the greatest story ever told.